The following posts were taken from various subreddits. The authors will be listed at the top left hand at the beginning of each section. A huge shout out to Snook for helping me out with this video. A link to his channel will be in the description below. I was a registered massage therapist for 7 years and had just opened my own practice. I was renting space at a clinic, and there were other practitioners who would often cross-refer clients for other services. One of the ND's clients asked her for my work schedule because he was wanting to book a massage. This happened to be the same man who would stare at me in such a way from the waiting area that I would have to close my office door. After receiving my contact details, he called me directly while I was at home with my partner and began asking me questions like if I were single or if I have a husband and when do I work alone, because that's when he would prefer to come for his appointment. This automatically gave me bad vibes, so I told him I'm never alone and that I was actually booking quite far out in my calendar, so he'd be better off booking elsewhere. I thought this had deterred him. However, the next time he was at the clinic, he booked in with me via the receptionist. He came into my treatment room while I was doing notes, shut the door behind him, and demanded I write my hours down on one of my business cards so that he could cross-examine them in person with those of the clinic. I told him I was in the middle of my notes, and if he were really this interested in knowing my schedule, that he could look at my website. He then told me he had scheduled an appointment with me for the following week and that he was so excited. He was giddy when he was saying this, and I started to freeze. I got up from my desk to walk him towards the door, but instead he took a step towards me and started trying to make out with me. He told me I'm just so beautiful, that he couldn't believe that he had gotten an appointment with me. That's when I realized this man thought I was a sex worker and that this clinic was a massage parlor. I panicked, but not before he began running his hands all over my body and tried pinning me to my massage table. I managed to fight him off of me, and he exited the room so nonchalantly, telling me to have a good day and that, again, he was so excited for our appointment. From here, I called the police. I explained to them what happened. They instructed me to keep his scheduled appointment, and they showed up and arrested him right outside my office door. He was charged and found guilty for sexually assaulting me. Before the arrest, he was calling me multiple times each night and just breathing heavily into the phone. I was able to get a restraining order from him, and just as quickly as he entered my life, he was gone. I did find out from the police working on my case that this man owned a nail salon. So the police suspected there was forced sex work happening there with the nail techs who were immigrants and relying on this man for their work permits. I'm not sure what came of that, but he and his wife still operate their nail salon in a local mall.
I was hunting in the northern woods of Wisconsin when I was 15. It was my first time going out and also my first time I was left alone with a gun. So, being a teenager, I was pretty excited. We woke at 5:30 and left before the sun rose above the horizon. Arriving on the trail, I walked to my ground stand alongside my brother, cousin, and father. Our stands were all lined in a distant row, separated a few hundred feet, located on the edge of an old logging road. The strands were easy to find. The stands ran perpendicular to the logging road, forming a straight line along the top of a hill in the dense forest. This wasn't your open field type of hunting land. This was real wilderness hunting land. My stand was the closest to the logging road, so upon our arrival, my father helped me settle in before continuing through the dark forest with my brother and cousin. I got situated and he went on his way. I watched the light of his headlamp disappear into the trees, and I waited for the sun to rise before loading my gun, as the season doesn't start until the sun comes up. Checking my watch, I saw it was about 6:15 a.m., so I had some time to kill. I decided to spend the next hour or so catching up on the sleep I missed the previous night. When I woke, it was because of a cold gust of wind that knocked snow into my lap. I jolted up and immediately checked my watch. 9:30 a.m. Fuck. I overslept and God knows how many deer I could have missed. After sulking in my stand, I felt pressure in my bladder and a need to relieve myself. I picked up my gun, chambered it, and walked backward behind my stand some 150 feet or so to make sure there would be no scent for the deer to pick up on. I opened my zipper and looked around as I did my business. In the dense white tree line, I noticed 3 men in blaze orange gathered together in a triangle. They all seemed to be talking with each other. At first, I thought it might have been my brother, father, and cousin. However, this was weird, very weird. We have been the only family to hunt this land in the past 50 years. Once I finished, I picked up my gun and unloaded it before using my scope to sight out the group of people. I wasn't hallucinating. It was 3 men huddled together, guns slung on their shoulders. I made sure to take a good, long look at every feature I could pick up on. One man wore a thick, fuzzy hat that was all orange. Another man sported a stereotypical lumberjack beard. The final man wore wireframe aviators, much like Dwight Schrute. As I panned across the group, the man with the wired-framed glasses looked back at me through the scope. I'd caught their attention and, fearing them to be game wardens, I dropped the scope from my eye, my heart rate hit the roof, and I began fumbling with the magazine I had unloaded. While scrambling to fit the magazine in the gun, I had managed to drop my glove in the snow. I bent down to pick it up, and once I looked up, the men were gone. Having realized the mistake I had made by pointing my gun at whatever could be DNR agents, I wanted to find them to explain the situation. I continued through the dense trees and saw the spot where the men were standing. Arriving at the point, I examined the snow, which had been undisturbed. There were no footprints. My heart rate quickened and I stopped to look around to see if I could see any orange through the brush. There was nothing around me. I was alone with the trees and snow. I abandoned my search and returned to my stand, anxiously waiting for the end of the day so I could report to my father what I had seen. Once we made it back to our cabin, I berated him with questions. We're the only people that hunt up here, right? Did you and my cousin stay in your stands all day? And of course, did you see anyone walking around, you guys, because I did? My dad thought I was lying to him, and it was nearly impossible that other people had begun to hunt on this remote land. It felt like I was in those horror movies where the main character tries telling the others of the danger, yet no one would listen. My father eventually talked me down and I relaxed, convincing myself it was a group of new guys who were testing out the land. And before I fell asleep that night, I began to examine the pictures beside my bed. What I saw turned me as pale as the sheet that covered me. 3 men, 3 different pictures. A 4th picture with 1969 written on the back contained all 3 of them. They were posed around a giant buck that had bled out in the snow. One man wore a thick, fuzzy orange jacket. The other man had a long, dark-haired beard. And the 3rd man wore wire-frame glasses. I sprung up out of my bed with the pictures and confronted my father. "Who are these guys, Dad?" I asked. "Oh, you wouldn't know them," he replied, returning his attention to the card game in front of him. "Those are the fellas that built the cabin back in '46 after the war." I felt as if I had gotten much colder after he had said that, but I pressed on. "Who's this guy?" I asked, pointing to the man with the wire-framed glasses. "Grandpa," my dad said. My grandpa had been dead for years, ever since I was 9. In fact, all of them had been dead for years. I will never forget the look my grandpa gave me through that scope. He seemed angry with me based on the way his brow was furrowed. I will never forget that day.
I saw a woman post on a local mom group looking for help, and my business was slow, so I figured it would be easy side money. It was very straightforward clerical work and seemed right up my alley. I happened to be the first person to comment. Side note, I live in a rural community, and this location was even more rural than farmlands. I googled the woman. She seemed legit, held a medical office, and had a website that featured her. Her pictures on the website matched her profile and her practice online. The work seemed reasonable, if not higher than what people generally get around here. But I just figured it was because she was from the nearest metropolitan city and was used to paying people city prices and not rural prices. I called her and asked some basic questions, and a yellow flag was raised when she let me know that I would be transcribing medical files into a CRM. She would not allow the files to be moved to my office, which would be faster, but didn't even consider having me sign a non-disclosure when I asked her to forward one to me. I just figured she was a bit ditzy. The next yellow or red flag was when she told me that she didn't have the internet set up yet, so I would have to type everything into an iPad she had, which meant that this job, regardless of how many files, was going to take forever. We made an appointment and agreed on a price. I drove to her home that morning, but when I got close, I started to get rumblings in my stomach. My anxiety went on high alert. The last road was a very windy farm road. As I pulled around the last curve, I noticed on a grassy hill up the way from the driveway a car sitting behind a bush, but it had a clear view of the driveway. Once you got close, the car was practically invisible. If I had not come from the other direction, I never would have been able to see the car. I pulled into the driveway, and it was a thin tree-lined gravel driveway, which means if a car pulled behind me, I couldn't get out. I followed the driveway to the end so that I could turn around, and there was a dilapidated house or barn at the end. I airdropped my Google location for the next 2 hours to my mom and my husband's phone. I tried to call the lady, but I only had one bar, so I texted her that I was uncomfortable and leaving. She told me that the house was down an adjoining overrun gravel path, and I just had to follow the gravel road. I pulled the car around and realized that if I went down the second path, it would leave even less room and was incredibly deep into the woods with probably no cell service. I left immediately and texted her an apology, letting her know that if she ever wanted to work together, I would be happy to do so in my office or in a public space. The car was still there with the lights on. She either blocked me or deleted her profile not too long after. She might have been an oblivious woman, she might not have been. Either way, I no longer do work outside my office. Anyone I tell that story to tells me that the hair on the back of their neck stands up, and they get such bad vibes. My husband thinks that it was a fake profile and some kind of human trafficking scam.
When I was a kid, I saw a lot of fucked up shit. I don't know to this day if they're real memories of weird shit, or hallucinations, or nightmares. To this day, I have really vivid nightmares that I wake up from unsure if they're real. One of the creepiest of these pops in my head often. My mom remembered it when she was still around, and she'd get really freaked out if I brought it up. I've been through a lot of shit in my life. Grew up in the wild west of the internet. It takes a lot to scare me. I couldn't have been more than 4 or 5. My mom and I were staying with someone because we were homeless, again. I remember the badass car with pop-up headlights they had, broken as it was. The trailer park was already creepy, run down and pitch black at night. There wasn't any light pollution that deep in the mountains, really. On this night, the lights had gone out. I remember hearing squeaking. It was late, but I was awake, never having slept right. I looked outside and noted that the sky was red and it was foggy. There was a strange glow that seemed to diffuse in the fog, casting a strange red pallor over the park when usually it would be complete darkness with the electricity out. I found myself feeling dread, horrible, terrible dread. I haven't felt that soul-deep, ice-cold dead very often in my life. The squeaking became louder and I found myself moving, but not of my own accord. I was stepping forward, placing one step in front of the other, while internally screaming at myself to stop. It was like I was in a trance. I was no longer in control. I began to hear whistling. Sometimes the tune comes back to me, and I find myself humming it before I realize where I know it was from. It was haunting. It almost sounded like there was several people whistling in tandem. It was distorted somehow. I found myself opening the door of the trailer and stepping onto the porch. Everything was wrong. The light, the suddenly warmer temperature, the cloying air stripping my throat as I struggled to breathe through my fear. The squeaking became louder, and I thought, briefly, how strange it was to hear anything over the pounding of my heart in my ears. The source of the squeaking finally revealed itself as a tricycle with no rider ambled towards me out of the mist. As it approached, the whistling grew louder, almost piercingly so. My ears began to ache, and I just wanted to scream. Somehow I knew this child's toy was something wrong, something that shouldn't be there. It held no depth, no color, no reflection, as though itself was simply cut out of reality. It was so deeply black that I couldn't comprehend it. I found myself beginning to step down the stairs, terror clogging my throat as I begged myself to stop. Before my feet touched the ground, and with the tricycle only feet away, my head now pulsating from pain caused by the squeaking and whistling, my mother grabbed me and picked me up. I remember this shocking me out of it, like cold water hitting me. She said nothing as she dragged me back inside. locking the door and closing blinds. I found I didn't cry, only looked at her in shock. Neither of us spoke. I don't think we could. She kept me beside her that night of the bed, though I don't think either of us slept. I asked her sometime later in life about that night. When I mentioned it, she had fear in her eyes and clearly didn't want to be talked about. I asked if she'd seen it. The red light, the tricycle. I asked if she'd heard the horrible sounds, if she'd been drawn like me. She admitted she hadn't seen or heard anything, but woke from a dead slumber knowing something was wrong, and terribly so. Years later, she told me she'd grown up with a story. A story, she said, of a tricycle appearing at night to whisk children away, never to be seen again. She said she'd felt evil that night. She said she hadn't been sure until she'd heard my night terrors afterwards, and had caught me on occasion whistling that tune. To this day, I wonder how she recognized something only I heard. The mountains hold many strange things.
When I was a child, both my parents went to work early, so they would drop me off at my grandmother's to eat breakfast and go to school from there. My grandmother died my junior year in high school, and I started coming straight home from school. During this time, my mother started complaining that when she got home from work, the receiver of the phone, an 80s-style corded push-button phone, next to her bed was left off the base. I wasn't using the phone, but she would insist I must have because the phone was hung up properly when she left for work. One day, I got home a little early. Now, I need to pause and tell you about the layout of our apartment. From the front door, I looked directly into the living room, dining room, the door to the kitchen, and the short hallway that led to my parents' bedroom and my bedroom. There was no other door. The windows were old-fashioned, narrow casement windows with screens, and we were on the 3rd floor. Anyway, as soon as I walked in the door, I clearly heard 2 footsteps in my parents' bedroom. I dropped my school bag and foolishly ran into the bedroom. It wasn't far and took only a few seconds. I got to the bedroom and no one was there. However, I immediately noticed that the receiver of the phone on my mother's bedside table was on the floor. It was placed so that the cord to the base was stretched out as far as it could go. I later tried to replicate the placement by shaking the table, tipping the phone, etc. I could never get the receiver off the base. When I finally resorted to knocking it off with a finger, it would fall on the table or next to it. The only way I could replicate the placement of the receiver where I found it was to carefully stretch out the cord, place it, and hold it there a few moments. It could not have gotten to that spot by accident. When I found the phone, I hung it up and it immediately rang. I answered it, and it was my dad. He asked what was wrong. I asked him why, and he said he had called, apparently just before I got home, and someone, who he thought was me, answered the phone but never said anything. He finally hung up and had been trying to call back and only got through after I hung up the phone. I've never figured out what happened. I definitely heard footsteps, and I'm just as certain there was no one there. The windows in the bedroom were not disturbed, and my parents had too much stuff under the bed and in the closet for anyone bigger than an infant to hide in either spot. Also, after this, my mother never found the phone disturbed again.
My very first job was a radio DJ at a small hometown radio station in the mid-1990s. This was a tiny building out in the middle of a field with a 500-foot antenna out the back and a single road from the main road to the front door. The transmitter was right behind my studio, behind sound dampening glass, and had a light bulb that was always on. The station was so small that you could see the light bulb in the transmitter room all the way from the driveway/roadway. There were only 2 doors, the front door and the back door in the transmitter room. That door didn't even have a handle on the outside, and it was always locked from the inside. It's impossible to enter that door from the outside. I worked the evening shift from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. After my shift, we actually went off the air for the night. I was always the last person there, so after I went off the air, I had to pull commercials for the first hour or 2 of the morning show, clean dishes, finish up some production work, etc. After working there for a year or so, I'd racked up a couple of weird experiences. Shadows scurrying around the corner of my vision, lights turning off and on. And one evening, after getting in and taking off the board, I was just sitting there, preparing myself mentally for the next 5 hours. I looked up, out the studio doors towards the front door, and I saw the perfect shadow shape of a man who was probably 6 feet tall. It was there, then not. I went to my boss, who was not a nice person on her nicest days, and said, "So, I have a question." She sighed and I looked at me, expecting who knows what. Have you ever felt like someone was here who wasn't? My boss yelled across the building for someone to come into her office. When the person arrived, she tilted her head at me. He's seen Jimmy. Supposedly, everyone has seen Jimmy, the original owner of the radio station. He popped in from time to time. He won't hurt you, he's just checking in on the station. So from then on, Jimmy would make his appearances. He was a harmless presence. My studio faced another unused studio, and he would flash the lights on and off a few times. I'd say, "Hi Jimmy, everything's going well," and it would stop. He turned the water faucet on once. He whispered my name in my ear one night, which freaked me out. At least I think it was him. You see, there was another benevolent being that also lived there at the station. It didn't have a name, and it was about shin high. This one always gave me a really bad feeling. It was one that would dart beside me, its shadows just in the corner of my eye. I always knew it was there just because I would feel downright freaked out. One night in particular was the scariest I've ever been. Here it is, 30-ish or so years later, and I still can't explain it. As soon as everyone left the building for the night, I got the feeling like it was there. I just turned on all the lights, turned the music up, and tried to ignore it. The longer the night went on, the worse it got. Lights were flashing everywhere. A dot matrix printer in the sales office started going on its own, something that never happened, and that office was locked. Then, ceiling tiles started moving up as if someone hit them with a broom handle. They started closest to me from the studio down the hall and ended at the front door, which was locked. Then the door opened. A locked fucking door opened. I went down the hall to close it and relocked it. When I did, I saw through the door window that there was a coffee cup and a cigar on the front stoop. There was no reason for them to be there. On my way back to the studio, I got a big burst of cigar smell, like an invisible smoke cloud right in my face. I know my usual duties were required, but I didn't care at this point. I went off the air, grabbed my keys, and noped right out the fuck out there. I ran to my car, backed up, and looked through the front door. A figure was standing inside, silhouetted in front of the radio transmitter. I peeled out and went straight home. Now, all of that is scary, but it's not the most unexplainable thing. It is 100% impossible someone didn't somehow sneak in and play a very elaborate prank on me. No, there's a slight minuscule chance someone did, but to this day, I don't know how. It was an old, tiny building, but I still hold the possibility that it could have been a prank. I got home and told my mom this whole story. My heart was still pounding. She was like, "Aw, sure, well, it's bedtime." So I go to my bedroom and dial up a BBS to write to someone about what had happened to me. As I was typing up the story, my modem speaker turned on. If you're old enough to remember dial-up modems, you know the speaker doesn't turn on when the connection is made. They wouldn't even turn back on if someone in the house picked up the phone. You just get a lot of bad data on the screen and your modem would disconnect. The speaker turns on and a voice comes from the speaker, mixed with the static of the data connection. It screeched, "Help me." The speaker then turned off and nothing else changed on my screen. That speaker turning on and the voice coming out is solidified in my brain. I remember the screech like it was yesterday. I have no explanation for it. My mom was the only other person in the house and she wouldn't have done something like that. She couldn't have done something like that. It was the scariest night of my life. I am as skeptical as you can be about anything ghost or UFO related, but that night is beyond my ability to explain. As kind of a footnote to all of this, I go back to that station every now and then when I go home to visit. I still know some people who work there. Jimmy is still active and is well known by the staff. The little scary one, no one else has reported seeing him.
I've shared this story on Reddit before, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. It's not exactly a scary thing I saw, but I still wonder about it all the time, so I'll copy and paste it here. My best friend and I would always talk about crazy dreams we had. Never thought much about it, until he told me about one where he got hit by a car and died. We were about 15 or 16 when he told me about the dream. We were into conspiracies, stuff like aliens, paranormal, lucid dreaming, so we'd talk about stuff like that a lot. And somehow he died right before he would have turned 20. He said he was riding a skateboard wearing all black when the car hit him and he could see everyone at his funeral. He even said his crush was at his funeral and we laughed about it. He just kept on going on about how it was so real, and it really shook me up until eventually I forgot about it. Then, a few years later, I'd long forgotten about the dream he told me about. It happened for real. His crush was at his funeral. He did get hit by a car and died. He was wearing all black like in the dream, his work clothes, and he was riding my skateboard. It was all true. I still don't know what to make of it all. Every single detail I remember from his dream came true, and I'm sure there's parts of it he told me that I don't remember. I felt crazy. I didn't tell anyone about it. I just don't know why or how he saw it happen in his dream, and think, what if he never told me about it? It just left me with so many questions. But I guess now I have proof, at least for myself, that our souls go on after we die. I just wish I knew why he experienced that dream and told me about it. Like, there had to be some kind of reason. I just think about how I wouldn't believe this story if I hadn't experienced it myself. Has anyone experienced anything similar?
I worked as a park ranger for a few summers. It was a great job, but the downside was dealing with the public. I have tons of crazy stories, but only one extremely creepy story. I was scheduled to close the park one night with another girl. The park opened at dawn and closed at dusk. The closing duties were to drive around and make sure everyone was out of the park, then close the gates. You had to make sure everyone was out or else they would get locked inside. Christian and I got into a truck together to check the day, use picnic area, both campgrounds, and all bathrooms. When we left the upper lot, there were no cars in the parking lot of the ranger station. Important later. We cruised around, checked all the areas. All was good, so we drove back to the gate and ranger station to close up. I got out to close the gate and jumped back into the truck. Christian pointed out that while we were gone, a Jeep had parked in the parking lot. We thought this was super weird since we hadn't seen anyone parked there earlier, but whatever. We parked the truck a couple spots away from the Jeep and got out. We figured we'd just tell the person to leave and then we could go home. As we approached the vehicle, we could barely see someone sitting in the driver's seat. We had dim street lamps, so we knew someone was in there. I waved, but got no response. No movement. Christian knocked on the window. The person didn't respond. We both started feeling like something was wrong. I got chills standing there, and we both stepped away from the Jeep, alarmed at the lack of response. We both decided to go get our boss, who lived across the on-site. We weren't supposed to bother him at night, but this was too weird. He got his shoes on and walked over with us. As we were crossing the street, we saw the door to the Jeep slowly open. Then, all three of us saw a figure creep out of the vehicle and crawl underneath. All we saw was a shadow since there wasn't a lot of light. All of us were scared shitless. It was something out of a horror movie. Christian got on the phone with the police while my boss and I slowly approached the vehicle. My boss told the person they needed to leave and that we were calling the cops. We could see someone sitting under the lifted Jeep near the front tires. The person wasn't moving or responding. Once the police showed up, they were visibly freaked out too. They had guns drawn and everything. It turned out to be some person tripping on meth. We had no idea why they showed up at the park or what they were doing there, but the cops did find drugs and a loaded gun in the vehicle. After that night, my boss changed all policies regarding closing duties. He added extra closers and we had to carry a mace. It was truly terrifying to witness someone creep out of their car and scramble like an animal underneath. It was like she was possessed.
If you've made it this far into the video, please consider subscribing to Something Sinister, as I make videos like this every week. Now let's get on with our final story. Every time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear someone walking upstairs. It starts at one side of the room, casually walks to the other, and stops. This will happen maybe twice a night. I didn't start hearing it until I was about 14, when my grandparents made me start sleeping in a different room on the first floor because they started sleeping in separate bedrooms. Anyways, regardless, both of their rooms are also on the first floor. For a little backstory, I have always been afraid of the upstairs at their house. I don't know why, but it's always freaked me out, and I refuse to ever go up there alone. I'm 23 now and still won't go up alone. There's one room specifically though. It's a long, narrow bedroom. When you open the door, there are closets on the left and the right, a bed placed roughly in the middle of the room, and a window on the far side opposite the door. I was told growing up by my grandparents that the sons of the previous owners claimed to see a gorilla come out of the closet at night, dance around them, and go back into the closet. I thought nothing of this story until I had to start sleeping in the other room, the room located directly below the scary room upstairs. So we all go to bed. All the lights in the house are off, and I'm still awake, lying on the bed. Then I heard it. A thump, thump, thump. Starting at one end of the room, it got closer to me, passed right above me, and continued to the end of the room, where it stopped. I'm wide awake, terrified out of my mind. It was no question to me that I had heard footsteps. I knew that slow, casual pace. I was freaked out and went into my grandpa's room. I told him what I had heard, and he told me that the house is old and it creaks. But he turned the dining room light on for me, so I felt a little safer. I tried going back to sleep. Then it started again, this time from where it had ended the first time, by the window upstairs. It walks over me again and stops when it reaches the door. I thought it was over until 5 seconds later when I heard it coming down the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence as it reached the landing. Then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And silence again as it reached the first floor. I was frozen in shock. Whatever it was on the floor of the house, and sadly unaffected by the dining room light. I was staring at the doorway to my room. The dining room light was shining in, and my vision began to distort. I felt dizzy with fear, so I pulled the blankets over my head and suddenly heard a scratching sound from inside my room. I knew exactly where it was coming from, too. My grandpa's gun case. It was a very obvious sound, scratching on the wood, long scratches down the front of the gun case door. I could even hear the door ever so slightly tapping against the frame as each scratch began. I tried to scream, and I couldn't. I took a second to take a deep breath and let out a loud scream. In seconds, my grandpa had made it to my room, and I was relieved. Needless to say, he didn't believe me. So I did what any normal person would do. I draped a sheet over the side of the bed and slept underneath it. I wrapped myself tight in a comforter, put on headphones, and turned my back to the door. There could be a party of ghosts in my room, and I would never know. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma about what had happened the night before. She said, "Oh, that's silly, Your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here. She came in my room saying, 'I hear footsteps.'" I slept under the bed for the rest of my week's stay with them. I've stayed there countless times since that happened, and I hear footsteps every time. I sleep on top of the bed now, but keep my back to the door and sleep with headphones on. I haven't heard it come down the stairs since that first night, but if it does, I don't want to know.